There we go. So we are recording, and that will be up on YouTube. The last session from last week is, and so anybody who might be missing a section can be able to come back and be able to catch it later. And for anyone who might be friends or family, if you wanted to say hey, if you wanted to see what some of the conversation's about, we'll have that on YouTube. So I will get that linked off to folks, and we can get that in bulletins. Everybody has a handout from last week. So this is the continuation of that first one. So last week we were talking a little bit about, let's go through some of the what and the why and a little bit of the where. So last week we did a lot with maps. So hopefully there's a feeling and understanding of where we're talking and some of the land and a little bit of that geography and what's around Greece and Turkey and things around it. But the reason I hope that that's helpful is it gives us, at least when I think about it, I like thinking, what's this big picture where? It starts to help me kind of put my brain in, when we start talking about places, I can try to visualize where stuff is at. Today, let's begin this piece a little bit more of the why. Could go either way. Could have done, and we tried a little bit last time, but if you look at your little handout, you do have a section at the bottom of that first page, if you like. Or you can just kind of listen. When we start thinking about the why, I think that's an important piece. Greece, most of us are familiar with at least the big picture, whether it's church or old school stuff. We know that the empire of Greece became one of the largest world empires. That whole Alexander the Great still gets in the news periodically. Not too many years ago there was this, have they found his tomb or this and that and the other, and big arguments between archaeologists about where that might have been and reports of this, reports of that. All the different cities that were named after him and things like that. But the influence, and that's why it's here, the influence that the Greek Empire had. And it's not just the empire of Alexander the Great, it goes back further because we see the ripple. When we start getting into the history of Athens and the Acropolis, and then eventually we get to Paul and we get to the New Testament, we start hearing references to things going on. When we start to see Paul in some of these cities and understanding where some of these things were and what they were and why they were important then, and references to things like the Bible talks about the Greeks. You ever notice that? There's a lot of times in the New Testament, and particularly we'll see the Greeks. Well, it wasn't just the Greeks of Greece. What we start finding is that the reference to the Greeks was really all of the non-Jewish civilization around them. It had become so prevalent, that was the Greeks. Greek was still the language. So if when we look in the New Testament was written almost entirely in Greek. We have little bits and pieces in what's known as Aramaic, but most of it was written in Greek, by far. Greek was the common language. Now, a lot of people knew another language, like what we would say is Jesus and the Jews, the Jewish community, knew Hebrew. They would also know Aramaic, but Greek was the common language that you could travel throughout that Mediterranean area. And if you knew Greek, you could get by. It's sort of like the combination of English and Spanish is at this point, depending on where you're at. So we have that influence that shows up in the scriptures. We have the major Greek cities that come up, and we'll get to some of those and how some of that happened, become some of these places where those early missionaries, where Paul went to and where Peter went to and others, ended up on some of their travels, Timothy and others. So understanding some of that is really helps us get a better feel for what's going on in the New Testament. So that touches on our Greek influence on the Christian faith and biblical studies. Now, think about culture. We talked about a little bit about language, religion. How many of you are familiar, at least with all these stories of some of these Greek mythology gods? How many of you get confused to which ones are Greek and which ones are Roman?
Yeah.
Because a lot of them, you can almost do a little table. The Greek version and the Roman version. And it's the same conceptual identity with two different names, and sometimes slightly variations, but the religion then that flows has really interesting influences because it flows from the Greeks to the Romans. And that's part of what's happening. Now, in the time of the New Testament, Rome is ascendant. We don't really hear a lot about the Roman gods. We hear little bits and pieces. We find some references to Roman sort of religion and things like this in the book of Revelation and some other references. It's interesting to see Caesar and some of that kind of. But to even understand that religious milieu kind of flowed from one to the other, part of it was because the Romans idolized the Greeks. Now, a long time, millennia later, we hear about Greek revival architecture. If you've ever done architecture stuff, and we see buildings, with Greek revival architecture. Well, the Romans were the first Greek revival. They thought the Greeks were so cool. They copied a lot of the buildings. They copied a lot of these things. You can see how they copied other stuff. And they also kept pushing some of that sort of Greek culture. They admired it. Well, then we have philosophy. Think of all those Greek philosophers. We'll kind of get into some of that. The Socrates and the Platos and the Aristotles. These, we can see how they influenced early Christianity. We can see when we just got done with heresies, we can see some of the Greek thought patterns influenced the development of some of the heresies. I have to get into detail, but understanding the nature of the soul and the nature of the body and the nature of this and what's real and what's not real and all that, those things influenced the creation and the development of some of the heresies we talked about. So these are all intertwined. Politics. The first democracy, arguably, there's interesting debates there, but most scholars say that the first, and it's not like ours, but the first democracy well recorded this idea that citizens get to vote for their representatives. At least the one that's well documented is the Greeks. We'll get into some of that. It's a different democracy, kind of democracy than we have today. The idea of the republic was very different. Who could do what and everything else. But the same idea, some core elements are similar. And then economics. That Greek world and merchants and travel and everything that comes with it. So all those are parts of it. So let's move then. Any other thoughts? Anything that you have on this idea of the nature of Greek influence that might come to mind, that you see or might come through in question about?
A lot of churches have that Greek revival architecture. We have big columns out front. A lot of Christian churches really got into that.
Yep.
Medicine's on this too.
Yes.
Definitely.
One thing I think about is how you talk about the Greek, but how important was the fact that the Romans copied them and made the Greeks? Would they have been as important without the Romans as they were?
The what ifs is no easy way to answer.
Romans spread it throughout the world. The Greeks were basically where they are, and even though Alexander conquered, he stayed in it theoretically. The Romans spread it out everywhere.
And it's an interesting thing. Alexander never conquered Rome.
Right. He never.
So when Rome came up, they eventually overcame Greece.
Right. I mean, most of his stuff was east.
He was going east.
But the Romans spread it much more what they call back then worldwide.
Yeah.
As much as the world.
Yeah. Yep.
But they spread Greek culture.
Yep.
Yeah. It was Roman. It was Roman culture, but it was actually they adopted Greek culture.
Yep. Anything else on the why and some of that background?
It seems like some of our laws, I wouldn't say a lot of them, it probably isn't, some of our laws started with what the Greeks had for their laws and the Romans had for theirs.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, the Roman political system was after Rome got corrupted, was basically the Greek system, but it got corrupted.
Both of them started with concept of, they didn't start. So Greeks came up with that republic concept and a certain kind of democracy. And when Rome first started, once they got to a certain point, they adopted the republic. And then over time, as most folks have seen, is it degraded as you started getting armies. Interesting issue. Once you started getting armies, and you got away from we are here and we can govern ourselves, now all of a sudden you want to get into the expansionist conquering mode. Now all of a sudden you have armies, and all of a sudden somebody comes back and says, well, this is my army and I'm in charge. But it did start with it, yes. So we hit geography. Well, let's do, on the back side of your page, a little bit of this major periods in Greek history. This, I think, is interesting in the way that some of these eras we've heard about, but to think about what's happening in this region, in some of these big, I mean, we're talking, let's start with that Neolithic, as we have up there. 7,000 years before Jesus. The Neolithic goes for about 4,000-ish years. We had in the map, and you don't have the map up as well, but Thessaly and Macedonia were sort of the, if you remember where it curled at the top, so Macedonia was sort of the top edge of Greece. Thessaly was just around that where it was starting to turn. That's where eventually we get Thessalonica, and it's the same term. So you sort of have the city and the state or the region or district or whatever you want to call it that way. So you had those were very, they already had developments. They had farming, they had settlements. We see in this time period, you started having brick and stone. So it was the transition from wood type construction to brick and stone construction in the time. Ceramics was developing, art was, you had obsidian tools and weapons. So this is before the Bronze Age. Early Bronze Age is when it transitions in. They began being able to travel out into that Aegean Sea. It starts to get a bit more granular. All of a sudden we get to that, what we would call early civilization. So the first of that, you had little settlements, individual peoples, but nothing huge. Now we find the Minoan civilization. That's when we get to Crete, we're going to find out more about the Minoans. The Mycenaeans were on the mainland, more so. Delphi evolves at this time frame. The sacred shrine. We'll get into that when we get into Delphi, but the whole theological, this mythological concept of Zeus coming down and looking and saying, here is this place, and why is Delphi important? But during that early time, that shrine started to get there. You started to have the worshiping of some of these early, the worshiping of the gods, the understanding of Apollos and others, and it's the age of the heroes. All those wonderful stories, Hercules, Iliad, Odyssey. That's, generally speaking, still 1,000 years before Jesus. We have classical Greece, Athens and Sparta, the development of democracy in that period of time, philosophy, all that. There's some details that we'll get into when we get into the history of Athens particularly. So when we get to Athens, I've got another handout. I'll give it tonight so you have it, but you don't need it right now. And that goes through sort of a more detailed history of Athens and the people that are involved in it, because that kind of rolls into it. The Persian Empire. So there you have the transition between what we would say is the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament. So at the end of the Old Testament, you might remember we have the book of Daniel, we have the book of Esther, we have some of those, and those are the ones that are having those conversations about the Persian Empire, the tail end of that, and the transition from Babylon. But Babylon didn't get this far. Babylon didn't get into Greece, but Persia does. So that's where that transition is occurring in between the Testaments. And then the development of Philip II of Macedon. He's the father of Alexander the Great. And that is that period of 350 to 323. Hugely important. Now, that is right between the Testaments. There's no reference in the Old Testament to Alexander the Great. He's after the Old Testament. The New Testament doesn't talk about Alexander talk about him, but we see the influence of that. The Hellenistic period. Now there we start to see, that's where we start to see the influence, because you can see that rolls right up to 31 BC. This is rolling right into the era of Jesus. The Greek Empire after Alexander, when Alexander died, the Greek Empire split into 4 kingdoms. The culture didn't change a lot. Now you had one kingdom that was sort of the central westish, not much influence in what we're talking about here. You had one that was sort of up into the east, not a whole lot of impact to what we're talking about here. But there's 2 of those kingdoms that split that we see hugely influential in the period right before Jesus, and that is what's known as the Seleucid Empire, and that's the one that was based up in Syria, and the Ptolemaic Empire, which was down in Egypt. And if you were with us when we had some conversation on the, I'm trying to remember different conversations with different people, the book of Maccabees, which is one of the apocryphal books. You might have it in your Bible, you might not. It's not considered scripture, but it is in some of the Bibles. The book of Maccabees is that Maccabean rebellion in about 100 years before Jesus. Use that for a number to hold. And the Maccabees were the ones that managed to kick out part of the Seleucid Empire. They took over the temple again, and you have one of the Jewish festivals that comes out of that, and that was looking at the king of that sort of Syrian Seleucid Empire was the one who proclaimed himself God present, Antiochus Epiphanes. God is here, I am, who proclaims himself God. And he was the one that did the sacrilege of the Jewish temple. So now that's huge in the time of Jesus, because everybody remembers that was only 100-some years ago. Think of the equivalent to our Civil War, 150 years before. They still remember that. They remember getting freedom, and they remember the Romans coming in and taking freedom back away again, and everything else. All of that is fresh in the time of Jesus. So we have the Essenes. Anybody remember who the Essenes are? Dead Sea Scrolls? Do you know that at least some folks conjecture that John the Baptist may well have been one of the Essenes? There's no proof to that. But some of the things that he did and how he kind of talked, and some of the idea of being out in the wilderness and eating the locusts and honey and all this kind of stuff echoes some of the Essene community kind of thoughts. So some people, he would have fit in well. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Roman rule. From 140 BC to 390 AD. So everything that happens in the New Testament is within this era of Roman rule. But it wasn't just obviously in Jerusalem and Israel. This was ruling that area of the Greek Empire. So Greece itself was under Roman control from 146 to 390. And you can see a piece there that's important is in 31, so again 30 years before Jesus, Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra. Great big battle. That was the last remnant of sort of Greek resistance to Rome. Once that happened, Rome had everything. But it took a long time. I mean, this was a creeping process. Rome kept giving more, but the Greek Empire was huge. So it just took a long time. Byzantine. Now we're totally out of Israel. We're not talking about the Holy Land any, but the Byzantine Empire was from 390 to 634 and ruled in Constantinople. And it's part of the Orthodox tradition, and they had a patriarch instead of the Pope. And that became one of those tension pieces that happens over time. Then you have the Ottomans. That was the Turkish Islamic Empire. That grew, and that was for roughly 450 years. Goes to the Greek War of Independence in 1821 to 1829. They fought and got independence from the Ottoman Empire. They became an independent country. And we'll see a little bit more detail. Once the modern age hit, from 1900 to the present, pretty stable in terms, they haven't really gained. There's some individual islands and little things that have happened, and you see some stuff that happened with the island of Cyprus, and you might even remember that if you're old enough. And some fights with the Turks. The Turks have got part of Cyprus, and they've got part of Cyprus, and they don't like each other very much. But then there's been different forms of government and things like that, and civil war in the mid-1900s. Economic struggles and the NATO and the European Union. So that's our big picture. Where's the United States in this? I mean, how hard is it to keep our history straight over roughly, let's give it 300 years and just kind of say that's about it that we can keep track of. This is going back thousands of years. Any last little thoughts or questions that you have on these big pictures of the history of Greece? Okay.
I think it's kind of amazing how you got like the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, and they were so powerful, and somebody just did them all in. And poof, they're gone.
It's a reminder of the scale of time. I mean, part is just time. It's a mind-boggling thought, but where is our empire at? How long did it take for the United States to turn from colonies under somebody else to start to get a sense of its own potential identity, to move from the idea of identity and wanting independence to getting independence, and then struggling with that for our own Civil War and everything else? And most folks, give or take, would say the American empire-ish thing, experiment. In a way, the empire side of that didn't really start until right at World War I. Right at the tail end of World War I.
Imperialism before that, too much.
Everybody else was out and bigger powers. We didn't get invaded. We didn't lose our country. We didn't have all these things happen to us. We were participants in it, but we were protected in a way. And when Europe imploded, in a manner of speaking, you can watch what happened with our film industry, you can see what happened with music industries, you can see what happened with science and all these other things, is we kind of like this. So we're only 100 years in.
What's amazing to me is how America and even Europe to a certain extent, I mean, you had other cultures, but how the Greek culture, again carried by the Roman, how it influenced world history. The world. Of course, we're very Eurocentral. We're not talking Far East and Japan and China.
Oh, yeah.
It's a whole different world. In Africa,
They've been around for a really long time too.
yeah, but I mean, but the bottom line is a lot of what we see today, and why not German culture? Why not Russian culture? We're Greek. I mean, when I went to school, you study history, you start with the Greeks.
The fascination
You
is.
start with the Greeks and you go to the Romans. You don't start with the Germans and go to the, you don't start with the Russians and you go with the Greeks. And that's American culture. A lot of it is, you talk about philosophy, a lot of it, because all our quote great thinkers come out of that background. And they, of course, come out of a European background. So, but it's just amazing how, that's the way it is. I mean, where did we come from? We came from these.
Yeah.
Culture.
Yep.
And and it's the whole idea of multicultural. I mean, one thing I think it may have been too big. Those other cultures were quite as civilized in their own way. They were civilized. I mean, because now you're seeing a lot of stuff with the.
Is this where the class is?
We're doing a class on Greece and the Pauline journeys. You're welcome to join us.
We are.
If you are, okay, so I was going to say, because across the street, which might have confused you, Christ the Good Shepherd shares some of the facilities.
They have Linton service over there.
So-
It's like church.
So we're St. Stephen's Lutheran having our Wednesday night class. They're Christ the Good Shepherd having the Orthodox service.
Okay, well then we're meant to be over there.
You want to join us? You're welcome to. Love to have
We may be back.
you. Okay.
Just how it influences tortuous was.
Yeah.
And of course, Christianity comes out of it.
You mentioned something there that at some point, the idea of expanding. At some point, most empires collapse when they finally get to the idea of expanding beyond they can possibly control.
Exactly.
And whether that's the Germans, whether that's the Romans, whether
Right.
that was the Greeks, at some point the ego of continuing to expand, sometimes economics, there's all sorts of reasons, not just ego. Some of them you have to keep expanding because you cannot sustain yourself if you don't. There's also, and where do you put the armies? You got all these armies. If you just let them go, you got trouble. So you keep the armies moving. But at some point, you, like the Germans, you just spread. One little country couldn't cover as much ground. At some point, they run out of people. They can't spread out. So there's, how did the Romans do it? At the point it does, and then it collapses again.
Today, now the whole multicultural thing is going on today. It's good. But, people talk about how they're finding things in South America that were before the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
And they had their own culture, but it didn't. The thing about it is you think about it, they did not expand.
That's right.
The impact.
You know,
Look
and-
what Great Britain did.
Huh?
Now, Great Britain expanded, the sun never set on the empire, and then they
Then they
brought it back
but,
again.
yeah.
They
Yep.
started, they just gave it up, said,
For various reasons,
Yeah.
at some point, it's really hard to defend little tiny places a long way away. As an example, somebody else gets a good navy and you're in trouble.
Well, Great Britain, a lot of what Great Britain did was economically, they had to have that.
Yeah.
It was survival. They
Yep.
had to go out and find some place on the side of the world to support their little big island. And
And then the whole time all this is happening, you've got the Japanese empires, the Chinese empires, the Koreans, and why didn't they influence us? They were on the other side of the world.
well, they
It's
didn't
weird.
have,
Whether mountains or
And-
oceans.
and they didn't have, their expansion was, again, to take care of themselves. They did, Japan was a closed country
Yeah.
to the Americans would open to that, except for Marco Polo and all those
Yeah.
things. But they did not seek to go beyond,
Not
we had a
much.
big area to deal with.
Yeah.
Marco,
Yep. And we had the big ocean in between. So they did, some of them went west, but how far? So you got, again, you'd have some expansion down into Southeast Asia, some expansion over into India. But the further you go, the harder it is to maintain that. So
And they
then you
took
kind
their
of,
religion with them too.
yeah, they took it. And you see India is this mix. They got all these kind of things in there. Well, let's then now take a look, move from the Greek history side, and let's look at some of these ancient civilizations themselves and what was going on inside them. Again, we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but to try to understand a few of these things that we might be familiar with from some of our classes and things. So what we're going to talk about here tonight, and this part of the session, is Crete and the Minoan culture, Delphi, the center of the world, and Mount Olympus. So the first of those is Crete and the Minoans. So what we had, as we shared last time, is, if you saw that map, this is sort of south as far as you can go in the Greek islands and things. So it's that island. You got Athens and the mainland up there. You got Turkey over in this direction. You can see some of those. So this is this island of Crete. It is long and skinny, and Heracleon. So this is Crete. Heracleon itself is the capital, and what we're going to be talking about, Knossos, the Palace of Knossos, and some of that is right outside of Heracleon. Now, if you're familiar with, when we get into the Minoan culture, they had multiple community centers. And we'll talk about palace. It's an interesting question. What's a palace? And how do we understand it? But they had multiple locations in that area, in that whole culture. So that's where we're talking. Now you can see a little bit about what the island looks like. I thought that was kind of neat. You can see a little bit of that texture of the land. It's got mountains. It's got beaches. You have some of the mountains in there are quite tall, they have snow for much of the year at the very top because of the height. So let's go to Crete. Look at my notes on that. Crete is the largest island of Greece. 160 miles east to west, 37 miles widest, and it joined the Kingdom of Greece in 1913. One of the things to remember in here, in the middle of the Mediterranean, think of all of the changes, even in the last 200 years, between Napoleonic French and things going back and forth, and the Venetians, and the so-and-sos, and the so-and-sos, and the Turks. You know, who's got the island keeps moving around. But it joined the Kingdom of Greece in 1913. Capital Heraclion. Population today is about 650,000 on Crete, 200,000 in Heraclion. So Heraclion is a good-sized city. It's nowhere near the size of all of Charlotte, but it's good, big. It's the fourth largest city in all of Greece. So you've some of the other big ones. A couple of big ones is you've got Athens, you've got Thessalonica. Heraclion is right up there with it. In the area of Heraclion, the port area, there's enough evidence that that goes back to history of 2,500 BC. And that's what's known as the early Minoan period. And Knossos is about 3 miles outside of town. So that was very close. And what we see there is that became not just the support for what was going on the island, but this island was a center point. Things moved into and out of the island, things that were coming up from below, from Egypt and stuff like that. So it was a maritime center point for a lot of trade. It declined. When the Minoan culture declined, then you had some growth under the Romans. It was, but it's kind of out there by itself. In 824, long after Jesus, it became a capital was made by a guy named Saracen, Abu Hafs Umar. He proclaimed himself the Emirate of Crete, and it became a pirate haven. So if you ever heard about, we hear about our pirates off the North Carolina coast. In that whole area of the Mediterranean, piracy kind of comes and goes and keeps coming. The Romans struggled with pirates in their era. In the 800s, you had different sets of pirates. At the beginning of the United States, we sent naval forces over to fight the Barbary coast pirates. It doesn't stop. What do you do when you've got an island? Who's controlling it? Well, sometimes it's sort of independent, not a city-state. It's a pirate state. The Saracens allowed it because it was preying on the Byzantine shipping. The Byzantine Empire was separate, so just like you had some of these places where during the Civil War, during the Revolutionary War, you had these privateers. So the government would say, okay, you aren't really a pirate because you're working for us. But you can attack their stuff. You just can't attack our stuff. So you kind of had that. Made the Byzantines mad. So the Byzantines invaded in 960. They slaughtered all the Saracens. They looted the city and pretty much burned it to the ground. And then they rebuilt the city and controlled it for 243 years until the Venetians came in and they bought it in a political deal. They did not invade. The Venetians, instead of the Navy, they bought it as a trade. A whole bunch of things. This was the time that you had 1204, if you remember, that's some of the Crusade stuff was going on. So this was a complex political deal. You had popes and emperors and deposed rulers and people trying to get back in, and I'll give you this if you send your people and help you fund that. And it just straight out of political soap opera. You had the Cretan Civil War. 645 to 669, the Ottomans sieged the city for 21 years. A 21-year siege. And they were finally victorious. Okay, ups and downs. In 1856, there was an earthquake. It's an earthquake, common area, Mediterranean. 3,600 homes were recorded as being destroyed or heavily damaged. Now that may sound big or it may sound small. Here's the counterpoint. The record shows only 18 homes were undamaged.
country?
in
In the area of
in the area of Heraclea.
Okay, oh, wow. And rebuilt completely.
18. And that was a devastating, and that was 1856. That's only 150 years ago. And then World War II, skip forward, and you had bombings by Germans, and reduced it to much of rubble, and it was rebuilt again after the war. Again, we're taking a huge amount of time with the kind of destruction, and yet the people say we're going to rebuild. We don't give up. Well, that's what you're going to do. Local products: honey, wines, herbs, what's known as Cretan herbal teas, dicodomos, olive oil. It's a seasonal thing. That's just kind of a neat thing. Crete is a wonderful place to go. It's a very popular tourist attraction. It is one of the biggest tourist areas in all of Greece, but it's somewhat seasonal. Once you hit that November period, all the tourism kind of drops off, it cools off. Guess when olive harvesting season is? November, December. So you get all the tourists out, and everybody then goes, let's go harvest the olives. And you need to harvest the olives because there are 42 million olive trees on the island of Crete. There is an average of 400 olive trees per family.
Per family.
Per family.
I couldn't
The production then is in the range of 60,000 to 70,000 tons of extra virgin olive oil each year. And then another 20,000 tons more of some of the lower grades. A lot of the little towns and villages have their own local processing, so instead of just sending it, they process it there, and you can label it and everything else. Huge tourism industry, 4 million people a year tour the area. It's the second most popular in Greece, the 20th most popular tourist attraction or area in all of Europe. Huge diversity of cultural backgrounds. Talked about some of the melting pot kind of concept. All these different groups, whoosh, whoosh, you get invasions coming in. Even not invasions, well, it's a stopping point. So you have people coming up from Africa, you have people coming over from the Middle East, you have people coming down, and some of them say, this is kind of a place to stay. So they do. The north coast is highly developed, the south coast less so. The south coast is mostly unspoiled. In the central mountains, you can kind of see, particularly in that sort of west central, you can have snow until mid-year because those mountains get as high as 8,000 feet. So you go from seawater to 8,000 feet, and you're only 30 miles across. I mean, you are going up, and then you're coming back down again to kind of have, because you don't have a nice, slow slope that spreads out. Yes. Oh, yeah. Now, biblical references, we actually have some. Okay, so we've been talking churchy stuff, I ought to have a couple of those. It's reported that this was the mission field of Titus. Acts 27, in a couple different verses, talks about Paul's ship looking for shelter on Crete in the port of Fairhaven. There's a port there of the same name still today, still named Fairhaven. And on Acts 2:11, it talks about the Cretans were present at the Feast of Pentecost. Now, Cretan, just again, that's not to talk about like the derogatory, he's a Cretan. There's a reason they said that. Somebody's unlearned and doesn't care, but that would be the name for people from Crete, the Cretans. Now, modern Heracleon, we'll get into some things, modern and ancient. There's a place called Lion Square. We're going to see that in a moment. But it's the symbol of Heracleon. Lions are the symbol of Heracleon. You'll see that. And there's some areas with cafes and things like that. But Minoans, so this ancient place in Minoan. This is an aerial view. This is not something I took because I didn't have I didn't have a plane or a helicopter or a drone. But I like the picture. This is a picture of this ancient Minoan palace, aerial view. And it is 15 minutes from that port of Heracleon. Have you ever heard of Linear A and Linear B? Have you ever heard of those? Two ancient languages. They're both out of this Minoan culture. Linear B is a little bit closer to our time. Linear A is a little bit older. Linear B, they figured out how to translate. Linear A, they've got little tiny snippets of it. So they're still trying to figure out how do we translate these small things that we have in Linear A. Well, that's because it goes back so far. Linear A was primarily by the Minoans, and we have not many samples. Linear B was mostly by the Mycenaeans, but eventually it got adopted there as well. This Minoan culture is considered the first known civilization of Europe. Before that, you had individual sort of little village kind of things. This is the oldest civilization. And it's named after the legendary king Minos. But there's an interesting thing to realize that there, Minos is a reference. What we don't know is whether Minos was a person or a title. It's almost like Minos could have been the title and you could have had different people, the Minos, rather than a guy named Minos. But besides that, between 1900 to 1400 BC, almost 2,000 years before Jesus, this was really huge, and in that period of time, that's when the Minoan civilization started to drop. There was a huge fire in 1400 BC, and it was hot enough that crystallized limestone. That's when this thing eventually actually totally fell. The Knossos capital, which is one of these, was one of multiple places, similar designs. It was built 1,000 years before the Acropolis. So as old as we think the Acropolis is, it's 1,000 years older than that. It's just a little bit younger than the Egypt civilization. But Egypt would have been considered European, so this is in the European era. Or it has the oldest road in all of Europe that's known, the oldest known road, paved road area. Let's see a picture of that. And it has some religious themes. You have the pre-Greek creation myths. Pre-Greek, you had Mother Earth sort of worship, the idea of the goddess of religion and the high priestesses for that. And the double axe and the labyrinth, so all part of it comes out of this. This area, that's a reproduction of what they think it might have looked at the time in its height, given everything too. Which is interesting when you say it's a palace, but it wasn't just a palace it was actually a commercial center. The ruins were first excavated in 1900. That got parts of some of the construction. You have the shape of these central courtyards, you have these wings coming off, verticals. One of the neat things that we'll see is when you start to look at some of these holes. Their architectural design was phenomenal for the time frame. What do we know about 1800s era homes in the South when you didn't have air conditioning? What did you do? Airflow. Higher ceilings, and don't put a solid. You want to be able to go. So what you'll find when we start to look at this is a lot of these were made to say, how could you get minimal airflow to actually convection up through the buildings? It was almost like a commercial center. So instead of having a king, and there's no evidence that they ever had a military of any substance. These were not a militaristic people. They were commercial people. And this was more like a commercial center. So it's more like the king and the priest and everything else that they had there were managing the economic life and a centralized point for that where they would gather things. So Knossos, this is from the street. The street was on this side of that railing, but that road has been at the bottom, that paving is the oldest known road in Europe. It goes into the Knossos Palace area, and you can see how far below sort of current ground level that is when they went through that excavation. This is looking into it as you start approaching into it, and you can see the scale of some of the building. Some of these would be areas of storage. There's areas in there, some of them are, you can't see all this, there's so much to be able to see, is pits where they obviously, it looks like they stored grains and other produce. Beautiful little sunset pit. You can start to see the levels of this. This is a neat room. This is an area above the king and queen's sort of residential. So this is below. This is a vertical chamber inside that goes all the way up. So what you get is you get the airflow coming up. And from what they've done with the archaeological is looking at the pigments and everything else. So this is somewhat recreated. They had to rebuild this. but they built this to be a demonstration of, given everything that they see, what that would have been like at the time. Combinations of stone, combinations of wood. But that's kind of what that would have been, very, very open to be able to get that airflow through. This. They've taken some of the artwork that they found, and this becomes sort of like a little illustration area. So it's not like these all were in this room, but they put them in here so that you could get to them conveniently. This is an interesting thing. If you look at that, you can see as the gal's talking, do a zoom, it's a bowl. Remember the story of one of the Greek heroes going into the labyrinth to fight the bull, and you have the princess that gave him the string, gave him his way back out again, and all that kind of stuff. What we'll see is a lot of evidence of bull. Bulls were sort of worshipped in the Knossos Minoan culture. What's interesting here is that we see what looks more like a competition. Everything that they've been able to find out and look at in multiple things is that one of the things that may have well have been celebrated, at least when they did it, was the culture of the bull, and you had, instead of bull riding, you had bull jumping. You would stand there, the bull would charge you, and you would then flip over the bull. You may or may not survive, but that's how you get famous. What's also interesting about this image is you notice that there's two different color tones. Men and women, both participated in this as best as I can understand. So there's some neat things here. Go ahead. You had a question?
Is that tile or tapestry or
That was painted.
Or clay?
Yeah, it was painted on the wall, so they were able to recover some of that, and that's a reproduction of one that's now in the museum. So they created a reproduction of one that's in one of the separate museums.
So
But that was all painted, so that was original kind of pigment stuff that they were. And again, you know, with newer technologies, you find something and instead of destructively, I mean, you can actually very slowly and very carefully recover it. But it was acrobatics. Now you start to see, and this is where this whole story of the bull and the labyrinth, if you did that in that central courtyard where everybody could see, you could be able to get in all these different things. That's there. But there's nothing. We don't have enough written, so it's trying to read between the lines. But also the labyrinth. Is the labyrinth a place where it was a penalty and you put somebody in? There's not a whole lot of evidence of that. Some interesting things in the stories. But anyone coming to this place from some of these others, this whole palace is a labyrinth. And you realize that it goes underneath. There's 2 or 3 layers underneath this, underneath that paving area. Just really, really neat kind of things. Men are painted in red, women are painted in white. That's one of the things they figured out, was looking at all the artwork that they found, you can categorize it by what color it is. And this is all pre-Greek gods, so you don't have any of the Greek gods in any of the artwork. What you do have is a lot of marine and floral, and it's semi-3D, which is interesting. So very early, if you actually take a look, you do have like the development of here's the front of the thigh, here's the side. So you're actually trying to represent 3 dimensions in some of the art. That perspective, trying to get that. So this is early artwork. Here's more. Here's a famous one. Now this was actually skin tones. There's actually a lot of interesting debate. It's been nicknamed this prince, but nobody really knows. You don't have any title to it. Some others have said, well, could that have been a female? Could it have been a male? Do we really know? It didn't fall into the white and red category. A little bit different. Just some other images. These are some of the areas for the kings and queens' quarters. So they've been able to figure out where these big columns were at, how those were structured. That there, with the dolphins, is part of the queen's quarters. So she had these wonderful seaside images that were placed up and painted on her walls. This is the king's quarters with a sort of throne That's the best they can come to the conclusion, is a sort of a throne structure to it, but a very different kind of a color scheme. And this is a really neat, this is one that's pretty famous, if you've seen it. Very, very colorful. It is sort of restructured and rebuilt. But now you have, again, part of the artwork. So this, again, is 2,000 years before Jesus, in this sort of general time frame. And what they did is they were carving in and using both stonework and sort of plasterish type work to create a three-dimensional, pretty accurate. I mean, they can try to get like individual, but very, very accurate, and then painted. So you have a three-dimensional style of art from 2,000 years before Jesus.
Looks like the frescoes, and the way they mix the paint in the clay, in the plaster, and then.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks similar to that. And that picture of the person reminds me of something you'd see from the Aztecs.
Mm-hmm.
It does.
Uh-huh.
It's beautiful.
And instead of the Egyptians where their feet are like this, and
Yes.
their hands are like this, and their faces like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's little influences, but this is not Egyptian artwork, and it's not that far away, but it's developed very independently. Now back to that one. This central courtyard, surrounded by shops and balconies, almost like some of our malls that we have today, these little outdoor malls.
First thing I thought of was.
Yeah. It goes 5 stories up on one side, above ground. It goes down 6 stories in some areas.
They dug through that rock?
No, they built. They started a little bit below,
Okay.
and the first thing they talk about civil engineering, the first thing they started when they dug all the way down to some of the lowest levels, they had a whole sewer system.
And what?
They put a sewer system in. 2,000 years before Jesus, they put a sewer system in. That was the first thing, because they knew it had to be at the lowest level. So they had a sewer system that they could route water to be able to flow, to be able to get stuff out. But you had to put that in, and then you had to build up from there.
So,
And then-
what was the population at that time?
I don't know. I mean, I've got a book and stuff like that. But what we know is that they had multiple areas similar to this. This is one of the best, but they were spread out.
They had multiple.
They had multiple of these. This was one of the larger ones, but they did have multiple ones.
So they had malls too.
And they were, but again, how far apart? So 30 miles that way might have had another one, and 20 miles that way, and 20 miles after, because it was a long skinny place. So they had multiples. And what was their relationship to each other? We can see that the culture was the same, some of the architecture was the same. There's no records meaningful
There's
to,
nobody knows how long it took to build this.
not really. I mean, archaeologists can get the best they can kind of.
People talk about building pyramids. They had slave labor, they had all that. Who built this stuff?
And in Reba, because you're also in areas of high earthquake. So they know that they had to rebuild it, but they didn't have to rebuild it as many times as you think. It's all stone.
It's right there, it's rock.
But stone is susceptible. Well, you know what they did? They took wooden beams and embedded them in the stone. The wooden beams absorb. So when things go and they start to do this, it doesn't necessarily grate stone on stone in some areas. You have a higher degree of earthquake tolerance when you have these wooden elements that are inserted between some of the stone blocks. I mean, really imaginative and good engineering for what they had to work with at the time.
Taking some manpower.
Oh yeah, it's huge.
Did you get to go down in it?
Yeah, I mean, all of these pictures were stuff that I was in, so these were areas that I was walking through. That's part of the sewage and rain drain system, just part of it. You can see where, like in the far end of that, it drops off further, so it's just areas that we're dropping off to go. Great big huge jars. Some of these jars are just the size of these things that could hold, 100 gallons of stuff. Storage areas that they've been able to excavate in some cases. It's so long that can they find any evidence of what was stored there? That becomes part of the conjecture. It definitely looks to be storage. but unless if it's anything organic, it's gone. You can see there the wooden,
Yeah, you can see the things.
some of these kind of things, and you can see where this is where one of those was to help protect. But the wood have obviously rots away. We gotta finish up. Last little bit that the bull Nero, the Minotaur, legend of the Minotaur. We have some other evidence exists that they might have had 7 men and 7 women going in to that bull jumping competition. And whether that could be the root of that legend. Condemned and heroes could be sent. The encounter with the Minotaur would be killed. This was that whole story. The Theseus goes and kills the Minotaur. But it is a remembrance that labyrinth, which weirdly enough, a labyrinth is not a maze. A maze is something that you can have false movements. A labyrinth technically has one path in, one path out. We had the royal apartments. Close up with this. The story of the end. What really caused the end of the Minoans? The earliest Minoans lived on Crete and off the islands of Santorini. Some wonder whether Santorini might have been ancient Atlantis. We have arguments about that. Santorini is another island. It is at this point, it's a caldera. That is the remnants of where a volcano blew out. Santorini's there now, and recently it's been in the news because they've been having earthquakes and all that kind of stuff. But what was there then? Crete, we know, as I've already said, became a trading hub. It had straight shots to Greece, to Turkey, to Egypt. The Minoans on Crete became wealthy. It's amazing. You could see evidence that things like raw materials like jewels and gold came into Crete. They had artisans that created stuff, and then it went back out again. So they were an art center for some of those kind of things. Santorini, we know, was destroyed by a massive volcano eruption. That is, again, in that roughly 1400s BC era. The nearby island peoples then must move. Santorini at that time, as best we understand it by references, was also a trading hub. But Santorini was also a logistical stop and almost like a navigation stop if you were going towards the Middle East, because it was where it was at in some of these. So you'd kind of get to Santorini, you'd come here, you get to go there, so all depends where you went. But if Santorini fell and you had disruption of the trade routes and everything else, the loss of Santorini's port and the peoples then impacted the Cretan trade routes. And it seems to be that the Crete civilization declined about the same time as the Santorini eruption. Now, it's not all that far away, so you also could have had destruction, some issues of earthquakes, some issues, we've seen things where you've got the tidal waves and everything else. So eventually the Mycenaeans, now those were on the Greek mainland, that was the transition point, and eventually they weakened, and they invaded, but there's no evidence of defensive battles. The Minoans effectively just withdrew and abandoned their palace. They didn't appear to have major military. They didn't fight. There's all the destruction this year is natural destruction in terms of other things. There does not appear to be any sort of massive sieging of the palace. It's just like they just kind of pulled out. And then it was abandoned. So that takes us through the beginning of that. Our next topic, we'll have, this is the Venetian, a Venetian fort out in the current, so that's the Herculon, so you're looking at Herculon, modern day, beautiful port area, it's just absolutely gorgeous. You can see the mountain in the background. So this is looking sort of southeastish, so you can see the mountains in the backside over there. That is the Herculan lion fountain in the middle of there. They've got a beautiful little square there. That is one of the ancient sort of traditional marketplace areas. So if there's one of those places you like the open air, just wander around with little bitty shops that sell everything you can imagine, and it just goes on and on and on for the 2 city blocks in any direction. And next week, we'll hit Delphi. And that's it for today.
Very good.